right, welcome back to the Woodshed. Today we're going to be talking about the idea of a pulse field, which comes from Denman-Moroni's temporal harmony, and we'll be grounding it with an example of pulse field 235. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so what is a pulse field? Well, this is basically a concept that comes from Denman-Moroni's temporal harmony, and this is something that a lot of people have experimented with. I came up with similar ideas separately, and other people call it by other names. But Denman has a really nice write-up about it on his website titled Temporal Harmony. And basically, the gist of it is kind of taking pulses as if they are pitches and creating kind of like a rhythmic chord. And so instead of a chord made up of instead of a chord made up of pitches, it's made up of pulses. And so basically he gets into this idea of periodic versus aperiodic, and then he brings in the category of polyperiodic. And so this is an example of polyperiodicity. And what's cool about this is it basically allows you to shift between different layers, and it creates this polytemporal lattice, so you can shift through different tempos fluidly. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that Denman considers these in terms of the undertone series, which it's not a real phenomenon as far as I know, but Harry Parch used this idea, and it's essentially the opposite of the overtone series. It's each subharmonic goes downward instead of upward. And so then Parch, of course, has this idea of O-tonal versus U-tonal or U-tonal. And so basically Denman is taking the U-tonal or U-tonal route here with rhythms. But you can also do it the other way, which I'll talk about some other time, and you just do it with tuplets. So with this idea, he takes the product of each pulse, which is like an integer multiple of some sort of reference unit, and those are the subharmonics. And it's cool because he's able to go through these different layers as different tempos. And you might be saying, well, isn't this just a polyrhythm? And yeah, basically it's a polyrhythm, but it's a complex polyrhythm that has at least two parts. And the point of it is to create an improvisation lattice of sorts. All right, so let's look at the example of 235. So step one, just take a rhythmic unit as your sort of reference point. So I'm going to use a 16th note. Then take the product of all your pulses. So I'm doing 2, 3, and 5. So it gives me 30. So this is going to create my meter, which is 30/16 or 15/8, but we'll call it 30/16 for clarity. And map out each of those pulses as multiples of the unit. So our 2 is going to be basically 1/8, our 3 is going to be 3/16, and our 5 is going to be 5/16. Cool. So this is what it would look like in notation. This top line here is all the eighth notes. So that is the pulse that's made of 2 of each unit. Then the next line down is 3, and then the next one down is 5. I put this at 60 beats per minute for the quarter note, just so that it can be thought of, like if you don't have a metronome on hand and you have a clock on hand, then you can just use that. But it's a good sort of standard reference point to just use a second, like 1 hertz. So when you talk about the tempos here for each pulse, then it will be different. So it's kind of weird when we say the tempo for the 8th note is 120, but think of it like the 16th note is at 240 beats per minute. The 8th note, which is 2 of that, is going to be twice as slow, so it's 120 BPM. Then if we take the next pulse, which is 3/16, that's going to be 80 beats per minute. And so if you shift between the top 2 lines, which have a 2-to-3 ratio, it's essentially like you're going between 120 beats per minute to 80 beats per minute, which is a difference of 50 or 33.3% depending on which way you're going. All right, and then the last line here, the 5/16, is going to imply a tempo of 48 beats per minute. and that's because it, is longer. So like compared to the 80 beats per minute, it's basically, what is it, like 66% longer. So that means it's 66% slower. Cool. So we have the pulses that are each multiples, like they're integer multiples of our reference unit, which is the 116. But when we start to fiddle around with this and create our lattice, then we can see that the cycle itself can divide into 2, 3, or 5 parts. So you can basically do it from the unit up, where you say 116, that times 2, that times 3, and that times 5, and you let those resolve over the course of 30 units. Or you can say, I have 30 units. I'm going to evenly divide it into 2, so that gets me 15. I'm going to evenly divide it by 3, which gets me 10, or divide it by 5, which gets me 6. And then, of course, you can flip those around. So you can say, I will divide it, 30 by 15, which gets me 2, or divide by 10, which gets me 3. So there's a lot to work with when we just have a pulse field of 3 numbers like this, even if they're simple, like 2, 3, and 5. All right, so, basically what happens here is that we have 3 different polyrhythms that you can look at, and they each have a multiple. So it's like a polyrhythm within a polyrhythm. This first one here on the upper left is our standard 2 against 3. And so we repeat this 3 times before the whole cycle resolves. Similarly, with the 5 against 5 against 2, we repeat that 3 times before it resolves. And then lastly, the 3 against 5, we repeat twice. All right, so here's the cool part. If we take this rhythm and we basically speed it up a bunch, then we'll hear that it's actually a chord that's just in the rhythmic domain. And what I mean by that is that it's slow enough that we perceive it as rhythmic impulses rather than as some sort of periodic function that creates a chord in its combination. So let's hear what this sounds like. Now, if we speed it up, speed it up again, and as we keep on going, we eventually hit a minor triad that's in first inversion. And this is again because of the undertone series being the basis. If we did this the other direction with harmonics instead of subharmonics, then we would get a standard major chord that's in first inversion.